to stand here, sorry. My name is Warren Ward, and I am very honored to introduce myself as your elected county surveyor. I've been a surveyor for quite a while, and one of the things about me is I consider myself a historian wannabe. And I say that, I know I'm not a true historian because I used to date the curator of the museum in Hot Sulphur, and I am a backup historian at best, okay? Maybe you could call me a ham historian. But I've always been very interested. We're gonna, in the next couple of minutes, before we officially start, let me tell you how I got here. When I first started going to school in 1966, 1967, and I remember my dad was a surveyor, and this is in Southern California, and that's really all I knew about the world. My dad did something called surveying, but in one of the very first history classes I ever went to, the teacher opened up a book telling us about George Washington, and we were all pretty, inspired by George Washington. She opened up a book, and there's a hand-drawn picture of George Washington as a surveyor. And so I'm making connections. My little brain is going full speed now. In 1969 and 1970, my dad, he was working for a construction company that traveled, and I found myself in Northern California, right between Lake Tahoe and Sacramento, on US Highway 50, little town, little logging town. And in that history class, we learned that this little town was on the Pony Express Trail. And we were also 5 miles from where Jim Marshall discovered gold. And so the lights are just going crazy in here. And I just thought, history is cool. So that's what I think today, is that history is really cool. We moved to Kremling in 1970, and in 1971, at the age of 11, I walked into the second semester of the Kremling 5th grade class. And my first paying summer job ever was working for a survey crew. It was then County Surveyor Herb Richard. And much to my complete surprise, I had no idea what anyone was doing, but much to my surprise, I learned that surveying and surveyors are directly connected to history. And so I am here today to discuss history of map making. This is a map, and this is an official legal map that was made in 1880. And you can see the Rocky Mountains. That's what those little scribbly lines are. So we are to the west of the Rocky Mountains, and right now we are sitting in a building that is approximately right here. So I want to take just 1 minute and do a hypersonic review of history, and I'm going to say a few very controversial things. Just humor me, because none of what I'm going to say makes sense unless we just have a few basics. My ancestry, I am a registered Potawatomi Indian, and my ancestors inhabited the Great Lakes area. They befriended the French. They traded with the French. They knew the Jesuits, and they fought the Iroquois. But because they were friends with the French, they intermarried with the French, and there are many Potawatomi today that have French names. It's also why I look more French than Potawatomi. But several events with the Potawatomi Indians. They fought against the British, and then they fought against the Americans. They fought with Tecumseh against the New Americans, and they were eventually relocated from the Great Lakes, first to Iowa, then to Kansas, and then to Oklahoma. And the name of my tribe is the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. And by whatever they negotiated, they split from the Potawatomi after 41 failed treaties. They decided to become American citizens, and so we are all American citizens, but our tribe is intact, and the culture, we don't have a reservation, but if you go to Shawnee, Oklahoma, you can go to their headquarters and learn all you want about their heritage, culture, and language. It's all intact. And with, all of this, none of this makes sense unless we start with the very basics. Map making. This is all about maps. And it's all about recorded history. So in 1492, a guy named Columbus bumped into the Caribbean islands by mistake. And at that time, he was the only human being in the Western Hemisphere, and I'm talking about the Americas, that could take if he knew what time it was, and he didn't have very good timekeeping, but he had instruments that could measure the angle from the horizon to the Polaris star, or North Star, and calculate his latitude and longitude. So in 1492, he was the only human being in the Western Hemisphere that could do that, and he was in a big way, he's the founder of the first maps ever made. And from that point on, recorded history included every encounter with the Indians. He named the Indians because he thought he had reached a greater civilization in Spain. I consider it an honorable name. I consider myself an Indian. And our story begins with the recorded history that was started in 1492. And by the way, in 1492, you are not getting me on a boat that is sailing west from Spain. Just that deserves a statue. So, I'm sure everybody knows, as history progressed, whenever you read a history book, I read equal parts, paleface and Indians. All I want to know is what happened and how did we get here. One of the things that distinguished the paleface from the Indians is that we had maps and recorded history. The paleface did. The Indians had no maps of any kind, nor any use for maps. They didn't like maps. They couldn't even understand why anyone would want a map. They named their geographical features by what they looked like. They named things like the Rocky Mountains, the Shining Mountains. They named things like the Uncompahgre River because they thought it looked muddy, and that was their word for muddy river. So you will never see a name of something that is after a person. In fact, the Indians, they didn't have any scalable unit of measurement. So even if they had some sort of printing press or political structure, a map would be an utterly worthless document to them. So anytime we talk about maps or names on the maps, which is all big today, we are talking about a place where the Americans drove out the Indians. That's the reality of it. We are standing in a place called Cousins Ranch, or the town of Fraser, and there's a section township and range. We're in section 20. That means place where the Indians were driven out by the Americans. And so this map is in legal effect today. So I'll start taking you through. Is there any questions so far? Here is a deed that was signed by President Benjamin Harris, dated 1891, granting an allotment to Potawatomi Indian, an American citizen named Carrie Strigel, French name. That is my great aunt, and I am standing here today because of this document. So when the Potawatomi Nation decided to become citizens, they all participated in the development of America, just like any other landowner. So I am going to try to convince you that surveyors built a country. I'm also going to try to tie in this deed somewhere towards the end of the presentation to make it all connect somehow. In fact, everything I'm going to say, a good presenter will make it connect in the end. So I'm a county surveyor. I work for the public. I keep a repository of maps. You can find them all on my website. And the word surveyor, since 1492, the first, for quite a few years, the first maps were made by observations from ships that paralleled the coastline. The surveyor was a guy who went on the ground with crude instruments and measured with steel tapes across the land. And this, one thing led to another, and we began having colonies where a British king would arbitrarily declare for the Queen a certain latitude. We hereby grant to Sir William Penn the state of Pennsylvania, which is legally defined as, and you would write down a certain latitude. And that latitude, a surveyor would have to go out onto the ground and figure out where that latitude was on the ground and mark it. No one knew anything until the surveyor went out there and marked the boundary. So eventually, the 13 original colonies went to war and separated themselves into 13 new states. And by this time, in 1776, the 13 states could all be identified by surveyed boundary lines. Things were pretty unclear west of the Appalachian Mountains. But the 13 colonies were considered to be defined states bounded on the west by the Appalachian Mountains, for the most part. Here is the turning point for the term surveying, and this is the Land Ordinance of 1787. The Continental Congress, not only did they come up with a constitution that is still in effect today, but they came up with these 5 principles. And the reason that this is significant is that this is the last document in American history where all of the federal delegates voted for it unanimously. You're never going to see our federal government vote for anything unanimously since 1787. But they gave us 4 principles. These people are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams. They all agreed unanimously to adopt 4 principles. If and when we expanded west, we would purchase new territory from the Indians. Each new territory would first be surveyed. They would have to have a certain number of people settle in the territory. They would apply to become a territory. Congress would grant them the right to be a territory. None of this happens without a system of surveying. And as the surveyors went west, any new territory and any new state in this new country would provide for education. That was a radical idea for every settler. And to this day, there are, well, it is not, they discontinued this around 1920, but they would lay out sections of land and dedicate 1 or 2 sections of land for education. That was Thomas Jefferson's idea. It was implemented for 100 years. My dad went to a 1-room schoolhouse in Oklahoma. And all I can say is that this little idea for provide for education, all I can tell you is that the greatest, capitalist country, the most powerful capitalist country the world has ever known, was mostly educated in 1-room schoolhouses because of this idea. Not every idea that they had with great enthusiasm in 1787 worked out very well. They all agreed unanimously to prohibit the British institution of slavery. It didn't work, nor did we actually purchase very much territory from the Indians. We purchased some. And I'll tie this into where we are today in Colorado, where a guy named William N. Byers honored this principle.
What does the PLSS stand for?
Public Land Survey System.
Thank you.
And let me tell you what that means. This comes straight out of the head of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who also gave us all of our weights and units of measurement. He also, Thomas Jefferson, understood the mathematics of geodesy. So with a pencil and paper, he studied, and his dad was a surveyor. George Washington was a surveyor. He studied the mathematics of a circle and a globe. And he implemented his knowledge into the PLSS, where surveyors would go out on the land and measure out square mile sections. And this started from Pennsylvania, came through Colorado, and onto the West Coast, and about 1/3 of Alaska is done. They're still doing it today. There are survey crews today measuring out square mile sections of land. So as they went on, surveyors, I always like to say, let's honor the survey crews. Quite a few of the surveyors parted with their scalps in order to do the correct survey work that their government had hired them to do. They got bitten by snakes, they got drowned in rivers, they died in the heat, they went over the mountains and under the rivers, and they used their knowledge of latitude and longitude to measure out square mile sections, 36 sections per township, all the way across the United States. And no one settled any part of the United States until it was surveyed. So you don't have any covered wagons, you have no settlement until the surveyors came through and laid out square mile sections. You had some trappers, you had some explorers, yes, and you had most of the people who went out west of the Appalachian Mountains, the ones that came back alive are all folk heroes to this day. What they did was extremely brave. Daniel Boone. But very, very, very few towns ever got started that way. There's only a few forts around the Great Lakes that predated this mapping system. So there were no towns, there was no politics, no political divisions, no voters, no citizens. We had no idea how to count the population. But it's all part of written history, and this gives you an idea of what the surveyors were faced against. The Indians eventually figured out you just killed the surveyors and then the wagon trains slowed down. They figured that out. Eventually the surveyors had to have the United States Army to escort them. One of the places that were the Indians disagreed with was the Yellowstone area. I'm going to tie this in later. I'll try to be a good presenter and tie all this in. This is from the Army Journal of 1872. They're trying to lay out a railroad through the Yellowstone, and the Sioux Indians are telling them, no, you're not going to lay out a railroad through the Yellowstone. A little bit more about that later. This is an official map. Township 1 South, Range 74 West. The first people, those squares are all 1 mile square. Once this map was made and approved in Washington, D.C., that is when settlers came out, and this way you could organize settlement. The government knows how many settlers there are, and once they reach a certain number, you can apply to become a territory, or a state of Colorado, or a county. But nothing existed until settlers came out with their government-issued deed to settle these. Everything west of the Appalachian Mountains. The United States deposed and surveyed sections. They gave away federal property to private landowners. And from day one, capitalism was built into the United States of America. And another thing about this, both Thomas Jefferson and George Washington understood the evils of slavery and plantations. They lived the evils of slavery and plantations. So they deposed of 160-acre tracts. And why is that? It's because both these surveyors who had a good vision of land size understood that slavery could not support itself in areas of land that is 160 acres or less. So they tried to build in a prohibition of slavery. they knew that one family could farm or ranch about 160 acres. And that is what they wanted to see in the new United States of America. Here is an 1860 map. This is the Colorado River. I think they call it the Grand River at this time, 1860, 1868. Here, here is section 10. And if you read the notes of this map, this is dated 1868, a surveyor noted some boiling springs in this area. And the town of Hot Sulphur Springs sits right about here. So the boiling springs are right here. And you'll see that in very old maps. So this is an 1868 map. It is legally binding today. If you call a surveyor and say, I want to survey all of section 6, township 1 north, range 78 west, that surveyor will look up this map and go out on the ground and retrace these lines. There are thousands and thousands of these. Prior to the advent of the internet and email, you could go to Kremlin, the BLM office in Kremlin, and look up on microfilm every one of these. Today you can click a button on my website. You can go to Denver, the BLM office in Denver, or you can just Google BLM, and all of these are available. Thousands and thousands of them. This laid out the base line of all title in the United States of America. And I like to put it this way. I like to say, ladies and gentlemen, this is the United States of America. There is no United States of America prior to the completion of this map. There are no political boundaries. We don't know the territory. We don't know who lives here. There's no law. There's no sheriff. There's no county commissioner. And if you go back to this, document, my position as county surveyor is the only position in this county that ties directly to this document. So when this document was set forth, enacted by unanimous vote, they envisioned a county surveyor in all new counties and states.
If a surveyor was using this document, I mean, what are they using it for? Latitude and longitude, or what? I mean,
all property starts with a specific section line. And so this is the basic framework of all property in America, of Western America. There were obviously numerous subdivisions. We subdivided and subdivided and subdivided, but every subdivision will have a reference to a section corner in a township and range. Let's go back to this guy right here. This line, this is the baseline. So somewhere in Kansas, some surveyor set a big mound of stone in the middle of Kansas, and he said this is the start of the 6th principal meridian. And surveyors started in Kansas and went due west, following their knowledge of latitude and longitude along the 40th parallel of latitude. This is the 40th parallel of latitude. And all of these are specific longitudes. So the surveyors went out there with a steel tape, a bunch of pack mules and a cook, an instrument made out of brass, and a lot of rifles and ammunition. And they laid out 1 square mile of property going due west.
Is this when they added the corner markers, or did all the pieces of metal that we find in our ground?
The first markers were stones. They're stones with little mounds of stones, and they would chisel the particular section number that they were in. So they set a stone every square mile. Some of those stones are still around. I can show you where one of William N. Byers' original stones are, just south of Byers Canyon. And surveyors go out today and they look for the original stone. And then in 1933, I'll show you, the government did a resurvey in 1933, and that's what this map is. And by 1933, I'll pass this one. So by 1933, they were setting brass caps. They set 30-inch long, 2-inch pipes with a specifically stamped brass cap on the top.
So is the brass cap at each one of those corners?
In this particular map, they would all be stones. They didn't start setting brass caps until about 1912. A lot of the stones got lost. Ranchers would take them out, or they got in the way of their haters. So it is illegal to remove a brass cap today. So this is every square mile from the Appalachian Mountains to the Pacific Coast, and you're going to get all of Alaska pretty soon.
Can I ask you a question
Yes.
about miles? Like all the early map making came from nautical endeavors. Why is a nautical mile different than a land mile?
The answer to that question is Thomas Jefferson decided on our behalf that all land measurements would be made in acres. And he knew, as a farmer and a surveyor, he knew just from his experience that a horse or a mule with a good plow, without any slaves, could plow 1 acre per day. And that was their unit of measurement. And the acre is the official government unit of measurement to this day. It's the legal unit of measurement.
How does it relate to a mile? How many acres to mile?
Yes,
640.
one mile is 40 acres,
Okay.
5,280 feet. But they started with acre. And
That's 76.
Isn't a square mile 640 acres?
that's correct. This map, going back to 1868, was drawn up by a federal surveyor. He had somehow managed to get through much of the state of Colorado on a survey crew. He kept his scalp. He was never attacked by a bear. He lived to see this day, and his name is William N. Byers. And when William N. Byers was coming through here as a surveyor, his eyes lit up and he decided he was going to start some hot springs. So he purchased the hot springs from the Ute Indians, which they dispute that account, but that's what he wrote in his new newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News. So it was official because it's in the Rocky Mountain News, which he founded. That's how people made correct historical accounts in those days. And so William N. Byers he did a lot of survey work. He did some work. He probably stopped doing these maps. Did one more township. He almost made it to what is known as Kremlin today, doing these maps.
So in 1868 was all Grand County surveyed, or was Byers just after that hot spring?
Byers was on the crew that did these maps. He predated any official settler in Grand County. He's the pioneer.
But was it anything other than the hot springs survey line?
He was measuring this line. You have to look at this. He was going along here with his survey crew with a 66-foot long chain. And they were keeping a good, steady latitude. And he somehow crossed this river, I don't know how. But when he got to this point, he saw, wow, these look like a tourist attraction. I think I'll name these Boiling Springs and purchase these from the Indians. So he is honoring the land ordinance of 1787, but the Ute Indians never really did understand the concept of maps or purchase of property. And by the way, I'm going to continue talking about names. There's a name in the town of Hot Sulphur Springs, which was surveyed by William M. Byers as a speculation of town, and he named it for the local Ute chief named Nevava. So there is a Nevava street in Hot Sulphur Springs, and then now is a good time to tell you that there are all of the names that you see on a map today were named in this fashion by surveyors. Now, if you look at this map, does any of this map make any sense to anybody? I am looking at a bunch of squares on a piece of paper. If you look at this map, and this little line here says Grand River, now you kind of have an idea of a big river in the west. And so surveyors named everything that is named today. There are thousands of geographical names after the Indians because of the surveyors' reverence for the Indians. They honored the Indians. They fought the good fight. They were outgunned. They were outmaneuvered. But their legacy is permanently placed on all the maps in America. There are 26 states named after the Indians. We're not going to talk about boundary disputes other than to say when the surveyors first started laying out sections and first started laying out towns and people began settling their surveyed property, the first court actions you see are boundary disputes between landowners. So we also have a long history of boundary disputes settled by the courts that we honor today. Here is a map that I drew up near Fraser, in a very, very rural part of Fraser. This is dated 1985, the first map I ever made that was recorded. And in those days, it was extremely rural. These landowners had a very hard time paying for this stuff. Here's the 1990s. Here's approximately 2021. And now the same area is very high dollar property. People are going to fight over a few inches of land out here. So the United States of America develops with the maps.
We redoing it for a property dispute? Is that why you went out there to redo it, or?
When we did that survey in 1985 because the landowner wanted to subdivide his 40 acres into 4 10-acre tracts. And I passed through the slide that explains it. I don't want to bore you with it, but it is the county that regulates all subdivisions. And so that was a map that was regulated by the county. And now that we have a county, the county regulates all subdivisions in Grand County.
So your slide said that the surveyor addresses precision, and then it's somebody else. Is this what explains like the 12-foot air in Grand Lake?
There's Grand Lake, the town of Grand Lake was subdivided, was one of the few towns that was subdivided by the government, the United States government. And there's, to me, when you say a 12-foot dispute, that doesn't faze me. But to address your question as efficiently as possible, when surveyors with an instrument made out of brass and a steel tape, they did the best they could, but their measurements are imperfect. And the laws, due to numerous lawsuits, the laws have concluded that wherever that surveyor has set a monument is the legal property, the original survey. Here is a picture from approximately 1880, and somewhere along in our history, someone invented GPS, global positioning system. It's a tool that is run by satellites that allows us to measure with much more precision and far greater speed than the original surveyors. But here is a guy who is going to lay out the western boundary of the state of Colorado. In his book, he's out there in the middle of the desert. He's fighting the snakes, getting bit by scorpions, dying of thirst. And he finds this chiseled stone, which is the Four Corners Monument. And that is where it was set in 1875. And like all surveyors, he with great honor to our system, and he started from the stone, and he wants to document where he laid out his boundary. And if you're standing out there in the Four Corners area, and when you look south far enough, you'll see the Ship Rock, which the Americans at that time called the Needles. There were not very many Navajo Indians that had seen a ship, so we know that they did not name it Ship Rock. All the names on the maps are made by the Paleface, the surveyors, but this guy called it the Needles, and he backsighted this. And because of previous survey work, he knew the latitude and longitude of this point. He started from here, and he began running the line due north along a certain longitude, and he laid out the state of Colorado. So let's talk about Four Corners. Am I out of time?
No, you're good.
Okay. Whistle when you want me to stop. And you have to tell me to stop, because I will talk forever.
We've got about 15 minutes and we'll have hit our hour mark, so I'll cut you off there.
Here is what is currently the Four Corners Monument. And this was placed in the ground in 2011. In 2010, thanks to GPS, this great tool that we have, a newspaper reporter went out there and he stood at this monument and he looked at his GPS and he declared Well, you know, this monument is not exactly on the 37th parallel, and it is not exactly on the 106th circle of longitude. And so he wrote a story in the Deseret News, and he said that the United States government has declared that the Four Corners Monument is off by a mile, which set in motion a bunch of other stories. The Four Corners Monument is not in the right place. And every surveyor understood what was going on. The Four Corners Monument was set in exactly the right place, and it has been upgraded in the exact same position as it was set in 1875. A lot of turning points in our history of growth in the United States of America. 1857, an attorney who is also a surveyor named Abraham Lincoln clarified how to set the center of a section. You don't have to worry about his technical language there, but he has been involved in more ways than one in the history of the United States. I'll go on to say something else about Abraham Lincoln. In 1862, a former surveyor named Abraham Lincoln was president of the United States during the Civil War, and at the time, in 1862, he was not actually too sure that the North was going to stay united. It didn't look like they were going to win. And so he put his mind to work. And since half the Democrats left Congress, he was given a lot of power. And he took his Republicans and he took his power. And one of the things that he did was sign the Homestead Act of 1862. And that Homestead Act also gave settlers, any American citizen of any color, and I repeat, any color, may settle any surveyed homestead of 160 acres, and this specifically prohibited any Confederate from expanding west. So the Homestead Act of 1862 used his awesome power to make sure that slavery would not expand to the west, even if the North lost the war. When I walked into my 5th grade class in Kremlin in 1971, I sat down with quite a few kids that were the grandkids of Russian and German settlers of the Act of 1862 that are ranching out by New Kremlin today. Justice Cooley. Justice Cooley is a justice in Michigan. And he just finally had to put it into words. Quit going to court over boundary disputes. Follow the surveyor. All of the justices in those days referred to the Land Ordinance of 1787. That's where the law of the West started. And they invariably would go back and say, if you can prove where the original surveyor placed the monument, then you can prove where the legal land boundary is, and that there is no dispute. Justice Cooley was one of the more famous justices to lay down that principle of law. Now, when you, if you are a surveyor, and like me, I'm fortunate, I work outside every day, I've walked all over this county. I mean, all over this county, getting paid to do my job. Whenever I get a day off, I go inside. But if you like to take with you a friend, a companion when you're out in Grand County, I highly recommend taking an Australian Shepherd. These are dogs that are built for outdoors. They absolutely never get tired. They handle any terrain, any weather. Their tails can't knock over the tripod because they don't have tails. You get two of them to ride shotgun with you in their survey truck. This guy, his name's Nash, and he absolutely could not wait to go surveying with me. He did get cancer and lost one of his front legs, so he's been retired to the backyard. But I thought that was a good shot. Why not put that into a presentation? We have a boundary dispute that I've been involved in since 1980. Morales versus Camb. It went almost to the Supreme Court. It stopped at the Court of Appeals. If this was a room full of surveyors, I would go through this in detail, but I won't. There are biblical references in surveying. And if I wanted to put it very arrogantly, I would say that wherever you find civilization, you'll find surveying and surveyors, at least in written historical accounts. Here we are. One of my predecessors was Frank Huntington, who is referenced in this museum. Here's a good map of one of the jobs he did in 1840. Today, Columbine Lake is highly developed, of course. In 1970, another county surveyor named Dwayne Phillips subdivided Columbine Lake, and here's one of his maps. All of these are official records. In 2009, I think, I can't even keep track of the decades, but in 2009, I had the great privilege of surveying some of the new trails, and this is a trail through Rocky Mountain National Park. And I don't even remember, but Obama had allowed bike trips. Is that right? Am I getting this right? I don't remember what it is. But I hiked and flagged all the new trails, and we connected with the trail that's on the east side of Shadow Mountain Lake. East Shore Trail. So I got to map the whole thing, and this is just my day at the office, and there's no real dispute here. I just thought this was a nice photo.
Mark, are you correct? That was the first unpaved trail open to bikes in the National Park System.
First unpaved, so we had to have a map of it.
18 years to make that happen.
What was that again?
It's the first dirt trail, single track trail in the National Park System open to bikes.
Oh.
And it took 18 years in an act of Congress to make that happen.
And so the only way to make it work is to have a good map of it so that the federal government knows where it is. The federal government inventories all of its lakes, every section, and every owner in the United States of America. That's how they count the people, or at least prior to statehood. Here is a land dispute in Grand Lake. I don't know if this is the right one, but one of my surveys went to court 3 times for the same line, and it aged me 10 years, but I broke no law, and at the end of 3 lawsuits, I was found perfectly, everything I did was fine, and it was the landowner who was liable for building a 3-story addition to his house illegally. He had to saw off 5 feet of his 3-story addition. By the way, I did not hire a lawyer. I get attacked. This may sound like the most ridiculous thing you've ever heard, but I get attacked for doing my job. I'm getting better at dealing with people who attack me. I don't know if I have what it takes to get deal with that. So, here, I'm licensed in Oklahoma. Here is a retracement of the allotment given to my great aunt in 1891, which is the reason I'm standing here today. And this really ends my print. Well, I have a few more, but this is near the end. This is how I connect everything. I have a few more. I'm sorry, I spoke too soon.
You are at your hour mark.
Okay. Custer, the only reason Custer came into existence in the western United States was to protect, the 7th Cavalry was ordered to protect the Northern Pacific Survey Crew. Here's a monument that was set at a time that he was in North Dakota. There's my contact information. Here's the Gore Range. They tried to rename it for political reasons, and I don't care what your political reasoning is. I will say over and over, please don't tamper with history that way. The names that were given to all of these geographical sites were done by professional surveyors. In Colorado, we have a Mount Democrat and a Mount Republican. They were done for professional reasons. Please don't go back in history and tamper with history. There's Ellen. She's another Australian shepherd with a couple. I could talk, for an hour on a name change proposal. This is a map of Colorado made by, I've got 1 more minute. This is made by Ferdinand Hayden. Ferdinand Hayden climbed every peak in the Rocky Mountains, not just Colorado, but the Rocky Mountains, and triangulated to every other peak, and made maps of the entire Rocky Mountain region. Here's one of the maps. This is western Colorado. And down here, if you look, if I could show you a blow-up, he has found, this is in 1877, he has found the southwest corner of the Four Corners, a stone set by Chandler Robbins in 1875. It all ties together. And on these maps, where Hayden named much of the features, otherwise, imagine a map that is all lines and no names. And if you look at that map, you will find more Indian names out of reverence for the Indians. This is the Uncompahgre Range. That's not what the Indians named it, but he named it after the Utes. Uncompahgre River. The Indians called it Uncompahgre. Yellow River. He named it Uncompahgre River. That's what it is today. And I'm going to tie it all together. This is in 1871, Ferdinand Hayden came across the Yellowstone area. He mapped the Yellowstone area. He gave the names. Yellowstone is what the Indians called it. I forget the Sioux name for it, but it was named after the Indians. You'll see a Madison River. You'll see a famous Union general's name on there. But this map, he took this back to Washington, D.C., and because of this map, the Congress was so inspired that they granted the first national park ever. And so the surveyors and the mapmakers really drove all of the United States history. Yellowstone was made into a national park, and eventually George Grinnell, and there's no geographical feature named for Grinnell in Colorado, there is in Montana and Wyoming. He lobbied Congress for 20 years to prohibit hunting in this great new first national park. And that is what saved the buffalo from extinction. So we're all proud of what we do. We do it with great honor. Try not to yell at us too much. If you don't, find your property line where you want it. Here's Nash again. He's my faithful companion. And we are closing. That's the end of the presentation. you.